Hello, I'm Emily Liska with the Jacksonville Historical Society, and I'm here today to interview a resident of Jacksonville, Florida, Glenn Gray, who's generously agreed to take part in the Jacksonville Historical Society's oral history project known as the Melting Pot. The Melting Pot Oral History Project and Series is funded in part by the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs. Hello, Glenn. Thanks for meeting with us in your home here in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'd like to start the interview with asking you about your country of origin.
You probably don't detect much of a Scottish accent. I've got more of an English accent because moved to England when I was 3 and really lived in England ever since until I moved across to America. So obviously one picks up the language, the accent of where you grow up.
And let's talk about your life in Scotland/England, mostly England, I guess. What was your life like there?
Well, it was a pretty normal childhood, I think, growing up in the 50s and the early 60s. Britain was obviously changing a lot in those days. The Second World War had ended and Britain was fairly broke, so everything was being established on new lines. We had the National Health Service and all that sort of change was going on at the same time. I attended a grammar school in 1966, which was for people who had passed an examination called the 11 plus. And that was meant to sort of grade people between, unfortunately, a lower tier for the secondary modern schools and a higher tier for the grammar schools. But I was only there for 2 years, and then the Labour government at the time introduced what they called comprehensive education, which was basically that everybody went to the same grade of school, a comprehensive school. So we kind of got mixed up in all of that and moved from being a rather sort of elitist grammar school, if you like, to being a comprehensive school. This had unfortunate consequences for most of us because we merged with the local secondary modern school with whom we had had a bitter rivalry, and of course the local secondary modern boys were a bit rougher than we were and took it out on us a fair bit, so there were a lot of fights and rough and tumble, an unintended consequence of introducing a real wide-ranging social change like that in reality. But it probably did me good because it introduced me to a whole range of different people I would never have met in the first place. So
were you in a village-like environment?
No, actually, we moved down to one of the new towns that was being formed just outside of London. It was meant to be an overspill for the East Enders who'd been displaced during the Second World War due to bombing and so on. So there was a lot of housing shortages, so they solved this by creating a whole ring of new towns all around London. There was Milton Keynes, there was Bletchley, there was Basildon, and Basildon was the place that I went to. Well, that was quite interesting because it was a new house. My dad's wages went up from £7 a week where he was working in Glasgow, and he actually brought home the princely sum of £22 a week. So obviously my brother and I's pocket money went up accordingly, so we rather liked that.
You mentioned your brother. Would you tell me about your family?
Yes, I've got a brother, Malcolm, and a sister, Sue. So Sue's older than me. She was born in 53, and Malcolm's younger than me. He was born in 58.
And your parents? My
mum and dad. My mother was an Englishwoman, is an Englishwoman, Patricia. She's still alive, thank goodness. My dad passed away nearly 10 years ago. He was a Scotsman called Albert. So he was a very decent man. He was the mainstay of his family. He always sent money home to people up in Scotland if they were short of money, Scotland being a poorer country at the time than England was. So we had a reasonably happy childhood, I think.
When did you migrate to the U.S.? Or assuming you did, when did you come to the U.S. and decide to stay?
Well, I came to the U.S. in 2006. We basically Kathy and I both basically decided we would live in the US.
And Kathy is your wife.
Kathy's my wife. She's an American lady. And we decided we would live in the US rather than the UK because Edna, Kathy's mom, was getting very old. And we wanted her to move in with us and look after her. And she actually lived with us for 10 years until 2017. She passed away last year.
So she was here in the home.
She was here in the home with us, yeah.
So your move to the United States involved what, a suitcase or two, or lots of belongings, or how did that go? And was it just you and Kathy, or anyone else in your family?
Just me and Kathy. With regard to the move, it was a rather heavy move. I brought a lot of books with me. In fact, there were so many books brought with me that the removal firm, when they pulled up, they refused to start until I gave them a tip to help them move all this heavy weight. So that was my introduction to American removal men. They refused to.
But didn't the removal happen in England?
Oh, it did, but then it got sent across in a.
Oh, and that's when the tip was required.
That's when the tip was required.
Well, that was an introduction to
It was.
the United States. Let's talk a little bit more about your other introductions to the United States.
Yes.
I assume you came immediately to Jacksonville, or am I?
Jacksonville was the first place that I have lived in the United States. So we came straight away. My wife was already here, and she actually helped me move businesses because I had a computer business, which sold in the UK, and moved across to here. Kathy put in an advertisement in the Yellow Pages because in those days the internet still wasn't that big. One had websites, but most people would look in the phone book back in 2006 if they were looking for a service. And we put an advert in, bought a cell phone, and the business kicked off from there. And it took off really well. It was a good time to move across.
Talk about your life in the United States, your family life, your business life, and how it's compared to your life in England.
Okay, well, my life in the United States, it's just Kathy and I, and her mom until last year, and our dogs, of course. Do have children in the UK from a prior marriage. I have Benjamin, John, and Hannah. John's 33 and he's getting married this year. Hannah is 28 and lives with her mother. With regard to John, he had the opportunity, well, they both did have the opportunity to come across, but John had his own relationships and friends and his work and so on, and has chosen to stay in England, and as has Hannah. But they do come across and visit, and I go across and see them. I do miss them, obviously. It's a difficult thing to do, but we've pretty well made our home here. I run a business called Compufix, which does computer and network repair, design and setup. That keeps me very busy. Kathy's a mental health professional. She's a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she works with the homeless hitherto, and now with the severely mentally ill people who have been released from the state hospital or are due to go into the state hospital, but there's no room for them. So she has her work cut out. So between the two of us, we're pretty busy all the time.
Could you tell me more about Kathy's mother?
Sure. I mean, she was born in Kentucky in 1918. She studied to be a nurse in the late 30s, joined the army at the outset of the Second World War. And she was based at Camp Blanding here in Jacksonville. Kathy's dad was actually a chief in the Navy during the war. And they met while they were both, I guess when he was in port in Jacksonville and she was in the army. And they got married, went and lived up in Norfolk, Virginia, a big Navy base there, and then across to Italy. And then finally retired back here to Jacksonville. And that's basically how Kathy and Kathy's mom ended up as Jacksonville residents.
So she died at nearly 100. She was 98.
She was 98. She'd have been 99 the following birthday. Yeah, she had a long life.
So it was Kathy's mother and father moving here eventually for retirement that brought
in the 60s.
That brought you here via Kathy.
Well, no, I then met Kathy much later,
yes.
But she was already here.
Talk about the economic challenges or successes of living here, and also as compared to England.
I'm often asked whether I prefer America or Britain. That's a very hard question to answer. I know that most of the people that ask me that question expect me to say that America wins hands down all around, which it doesn't. I would say that a combination of the two countries would be pretty ideal in my mind, the best of each country, as it were, without the worst of each country.
Could you detail that, the best and the worst of each country? From your perspective, obviously.
It's difficult because, a lot of my best of Britain is based upon my recollection of what it used to be, and things change. And they don't always change for the best. A lot of the things that I valued most about Britain have unfortunately changed a lot. But what I did value very much was the system of education. I went to university. I didn't have to pay a penny. I had a full grant. The tuition fees were paid, accommodation was provided. It wasn't much, it was a tight fit, but it wasn't meant to enable you to live in luxury, but it paid for your education and a basic student support. I do miss that kind of thing. Truth be told, I have a streak of socialism in me, as a lot of people from the old country do. I do believe in universal education, and I do believe in single-payer universal healthcare. My experience with the healthcare system in the UK is that the system is great. It never failed my family once, through my father having an aortic aneurysm, my mother obviously having children. My mother suffered from tuberculosis. She was in 9 months in a sanatorium. This was all paid for. My father had a dislocated retina, and that was all treated. And latterly, when he had cancer, he was treated very well there too. So I can't fault the universal healthcare system, and I think this was put into highlight during the discussions about Obamacare coming out. There was an awful lot of misinformation being bandied around over here about the shortcomings of the healthcare system compared with the system over here, and also the shortcomings of the Canadian healthcare system. People were making such puerile arguments as well. If the healthcare system's so bad here, why do people come from all over the world? Well, the simple reason is because you have great hospitals, you have great doctors, you have great nurses, you have great medical research. What you don't have is a system that actually enables people to afford that unless they're actually employed and with a company medical healthcare system. Obamacare was a real failure because it really didn't go nearly far enough. I think the fact that the US has one of the most expensive healthcare systems per capita in the world is unusual, because most countries that have universal healthcare spend far less per capita on the recipients than the US does. So there's something severely wrong with the US healthcare system. You probably gathered that's my opinion by now. So that, I would say, is a real shortcoming. I think it's a damn shame that, pardon my expression, I think it's a real shame that so many people are uninsured. There's no excuse for it. There really isn't. It's not really a privilege to have health care, and in my opinion, it's a basic human right of any decent civilized country to look after those who can't look after themselves. That includes health care and education. With that proviso, and the fact that don't agree with the death penalty. And I don't like American football, but then I don't like British football either. Apart from that, I think the people over here are great. I like the people very much.
Give examples of why you like the people. What's great about the people in America, or Jacksonville specifically?
I would certainly, until this terrible polarizing time we're now in, and let's face it, whatever one's complexion of belief is, we are in a very polarized position, more so even than before, and it was bad enough before. Despite that, most Americans, I think, do have an aspiration that things can get better. And I think that's probably the best part of the American dream, that by your own work, by your own effort, and I'm a great believer, despite thinking that everybody should have universal health care, I am a great believer in working hard and doing the best that you can for your family, by your own effort. And I think it's terrible that some people are happy to coast by and just take handouts. But I think the attitude, the optimism of the Americans that I've come across, more you could exemplify it as a can-do attitude, if you like. That's very good. If we could just apply it to solving the problems that we currently face, that would be even better.
When you look at cultural life in England and cultural life here, and other aspects of just how you live day to day, what are the differences with what you do for entertainment, what you do for food, dining, culinary experiences?
This is such a good question, but you know, the difficulty with that is that I'm even now just thinking maybe 12 years back. The past is a different country. And you know, the Britain that I remember is no longer, I'm sure, and is probably nearer to what it is over here. For instance, you know, streaming movies, binge watching TV. I mean, this sort of thing goes on all around the world these days. And didn't exist when I was in the UK. So you know, I'm comparing the past over there with the present now.
You're talking about what could be sameness of experience.
There is. I mean, there's more of a convergence going on than a divergence in reality. I would say that probably the pub has a more central location in normal British life than the local bar does here. I mean, one would be probably rightly disapproved of if one popped into the local bar several times a week to have a few drinks on the way home. It would be considered to be signs of a problem. Whereas that's quite a normal mode of behaviour in the UK, where the pub can very often be the core of the village life, for instance. And it's normal just to pop in and have a beer or something of that sort several times a week. So that's probably something that's different. There is a more of a communal life in smaller villages over there than there probably is in the type of housing structures we've got over here. But then again, if you were to take a similar type of housing development in Britain, and they do exist, it would be pretty similar to here too. There wouldn't be much communality at all. Obviously, if you live in a large city like London, you've got all the resources of museums, ballet, theatre, but the same thing would happen in Washington or New York. So, you know, large cities are pretty much the same everywhere these days. There's less difference than there used to be.
Tell me about your daily life here in Jacksonville, Florida.
Well, I get up at 6 in the morning and feed the dogs, get Kathy a cup of tea, make myself a cup of tea, do a little bit of preparatory work, maybe a little bit of housework if anything needs to be done. Usually I'm out of here by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning if I've got appointments with customers. If not, I'll work in my office back there and do remote work with various clients. Have lunch about 1 o'clock, more work until about 6. We'll cook dinner together usually.
So you typically dine at home.
Around about 8 o'clock at night, 8 to 8:30 at night.
So
I guess that's a little
very
more
European.
Sometimes 9 or 10 o'clock. It used to drive Kathy's mum to distraction sometimes, because she would rather have had the early bird special about 4 in the afternoon probably, but she usually got served at dinner at 8 o'clock or thereabouts, and she ended up putting up with that. And then after that, usually I may do a little bit more work, or we may watch a movie, and then it's time for bed and time to go to sleep.
Do you go to museums here? Do you go to sports activities? Do you dine out ever? And if so, what are some of those
My
activities?
father was a great sportsman, as well as is my son, and I kind of missed out on it. We had to do cricket, rugby, and football or soccer at school. So I'm not really all that interested in those sports, which I did as a child, nor in the sports that are over here. I'm really not interested in sports at all.
What about museums and,
Oh, yeah.
and the dining out?
Oh, absolutely. Museums. We go to the Cummer sometimes, especially on the free Saturdays. That's always worth going. The Museum of Art on Laura Street. And we sometimes go to the Lightner Museum down in St. Augustine. But there's only a limited number of times you can go to that. You need to give it a rest after a little while. Dine out, we tend to do more cooking ourselves than to dine out. We'll maybe dine out maybe twice a month. A favourite's a little hole-in-the-wall Mexican joint called Mi Veracruz. You know it's pretty good because everybody there's speaking Spanish, and so that's nice to go to. But no, we're not great eaters out. We used to do a lot more eating out in the UK.
Is that because you preferred the food there or the social
No, I think it's
life
just because
around
we're
it?
older.
Okay, you're older. Okay,
I
that's
think it's just because we're
product
older.
of time then.
I think so. People change throughout life, don't they?
I would agree. Talk about how long you think you'll stay here. Do you think you've mentioned you thought you were likely here to stay, but do you think there's a chance you'll go back? And have you sought U.S. citizenship? I think you're automatically somehow eligible for that. Do you?
I'm eligible for it.
Since you're married to a
Since I'm married
citizen.
to a United States citizen, being eligible for something doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically get it, of course. I think I could probably pass the citizenship exam at the drop of a hat. I am interested in American history and civics too. I think without sort of doing Kathy any disfavours, I know more about it than she does because she's not really interested in civics or history. So I think I could probably pass the examination, and I shall probably go ahead and take American citizenship. I've been eligible for it for 7 years, and I don't really know why I haven't gotten around to doing it. The strange thing about US citizenship and British citizenship, of course, is it's quite possible to have joint citizenship. One does not automatically give up one's British citizenship by taking the citizenship of another country. So one ends up with 2 passports. You have to use your US passport if you're coming back into the US, and you have to use your British passport if you're going into Britain. Otherwise, you can choose to use whichever one you want when you go to any other country. So it's an interesting idea. You could decide which country was perhaps going to be marginally more welcome at any given time. And they're probably both going to be unwelcome.
And did I understand you to say you and Kathy would probably remain here
Yes, I think we probably will.
and spend the rest of your life?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that we'll maybe sell this place and move into a smaller place and maybe get a small place up in North Carolina and sort of split the seasons between the two. You know, I guess that's going to be summer in North Carolina and winter in Florida, although I rather like the idea of snow.
Could you pull off that same dual living in England or surrounds, do you think? With
Probably
seasonal?
not. Probably not. I mean, yes, with the seasonal differences between the north and the south to a certain extent, although southern England is not as hot as Florida by any means, and northern Scotland is probably as cold as North Carolina or considerably colder. But it would be more difficult to do that for financial reasons. The financial reasons being property is much more expensive in Britain than it is in Florida. But then again, property is very expensive in California or Hawaii. And Hawaii is probably a good example. It's a small island. Britain's a small island. Property prices are about 4 times the price of here at least. So that would be difficult to swing, to have 2 places to live in unless one were significantly more wealthy than we are.
So you've talked a little bit about your hopes and dreams with this possibly dual residency within the United States. What are other hopes and dreams you have for your life here?
Well, we're planning to retire in 4 years' time, so it would be nice to just spend more time reading and pottering around and not having to worry about hard work so much anymore. Maybe just going up to North Carolina in the summer months and going across to the UK to visit family, having them over here to see us. It's very simple stuff, nothing elaborate at all. But it sounds pretty good to me.
It does indeed to me as well. Let me finish up by asking you, and I may have already done this in other ways, what do you like best about this country? What do you like least? And what do you miss most about your mother country, the country of your origin?
Well, this is such a huge country and there's so many wonderful places to see. So I think the sheer size and diversity of the place is impressive. One could, and I understand why an awful lot of people over here do just live all their lives in America without going abroad, because there's so much to see, from California to Texas to New York, and even up into Canada. You know, I know Canada's another country, but it's part of the same area. There's just so much to see. And I think the optimism, I would have said the optimism. I think people are a little pessimistic now, but overall I think there is still an optimism that things can be put right, and that I would tend to agree that the promise of America is the best thing we have in this world. It's not always lived up to, but it is something to aspire to, and I think that's rather nice to have.
And as you're talking about the positives of this country, have you affiliated with any groups here, be it religious, be it social, such as a club or organization?
No, we're not very social people, unfortunately. I think we're both introverts, and to that extent we don't kind of mix all that well. And you know, we've just been so busy, and until last February, all of our time really, that apart from working, was spent with the sheer mechanics of having an elderly person living in the house, particularly in the last few years as she was dying. It's incredibly demanding. It surprised me just how difficult that was, and so far that whole period really, there was never really any spare time for us to spend time together. So we didn't have time for extras. Not that they're not important, they are, but we didn't have time for extras like social clubs and so on. With regard to religion, that's a difficult question.
Did you grow up connected to any religion at all?
No,
Okay.
my mother and father were both, it would be polite to describe them as agnostic. Mm-hmm. That was not actually an unusual position to have in the UK in those days. There were very few active church goers in Britain in the 50s and 60s. It's unusual. You perhaps can't imagine that, but if one went to a church, of England church in the 60s, it would usually be filled with just some very old people in the congregation, and maybe 1/10 of the church was full. I think with the rise of born-again Christianity as a worldwide movement, that's changed to a certain extent, but it's still very much the case that Europe is much more secular than certainly the South over here. Kathy's actually a Jew by conversion, although latterly I think she prefers Buddhism and Sikhism. She's certainly somebody who's interested in religion in sort of the wider sphere of things. I studied philosophy, politics and economics at university, so I'm interested in philosophical questions in general. As to religion, well, I do believe in God, but I think that's about as far as I could really say at the moment. I mean, I do read a lot of religious theory. I've got a lot of books about God. I also have a lot of books about atheism. Although I'm not an atheist, I'm interested in the idea. But that doesn't really fit in very well with attending a church, because there aren't really sort of churches for people that are interested in religion but don't follow a particular strand at any given time. But I like to think that we do think actively about moral questions and ethical questions and religious questions as much as the normal churchgoer, probably.
But in your day-to-day life, not having membership in any local club or group,
we wish we did.
You actually, okay, you wish you did, perhaps.
Well, of course, because there is a social support, and we saw that with Kathy's mom, although she wasn't a very religious person at all, and she certainly wouldn't think about reading the Bible or thinking about deep questions, but her church membership gave her a great deal of comfort as a social support.
And any final thoughts on your life here in Jacksonville at all, and the possibility of becoming a U.S. citizen? Any
I probably
thoughts at all?
will, yes, I probably will. All this talk about immigration and stuff has made me, as an immigrant, very unsettled. Because whilst I am a permanent resident of the United States, which allows me to stay here for the rest of my life without being bothered by anybody, there isn't the administrative requirement of renewing the registration document, not the registration or the status itself, but the document every 10 years. And of course, one wouldn't be normal without sometimes worrying about what happens if they change the rules overnight and you wake up and suddenly President Trump has decided that he doesn't want anybody over here for whatever reason. I'm probably okay because I'm white, thank goodness. I'd hate to be anything other than that at the moment. But yes, I think I would take the citizenship. Take the exam and see whether you'll have me as a citizen.
Well, Mr. Gray, I want to thank you for your interview and sharing your thoughts about your time here in Jacksonville, Florida. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay.